My name is Sami, I am from Sudan.
Hello, I'm Catherine from Tanzania.
Bonjour, moi je viens du Mali.
Elisa Lopes, Antonio, Angolana.
Hi, my name is Ryan from Kenya.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Sophie Thiam, je viens de la Côte d'Ivoire.
Most things in China is industries, factories, and shops where you can sell and buy, you know. This place is a new world. It's a land of opportunity.
You see somebody who is coming from out. He has nice shoes, he got a car.
He has a nice house.
How did you make money? My dear, I went to China. Then the person will tell you the story. You do this and you think it is very easy. That when you go to China, you all speak dollars from maybe a tree and get a car as he is doing. So you come to China. It's not easy. It's not easy at all to make a coin in China.
So again, thanks for joining us for today's event. We'll be having a discussion with the filmmaker Christiane Badgley from the film Guangzhou Dream Factory, and then our faculty discussant, Professors Tristan, Ivory, and Leigh Goffe. I'm Kun Huang, a PhD student in comparative literature and an officer of the East Asia Program Graduate Student Committee, and I will be moderating the conversation today. This event is jointly hosted by the East Asia Program Graduate Student Steering Committee and the Afro-Asia Group. And I would like to thank the East Asia Program for sponsoring the event and thank Cornell Cinema, the Anadi Center Migrations Initiative, and Professor Suyong Sun of Intro to China, among many others, for helping to promote this event. And the event is being recorded and will be made streamable for a period of time. Now, I will briefly introduce all our speakers today. Christiane Badgley is a director and editor of social issue documentaries. Christiane began working on African issues 20 years ago, documenting the impact of Western media on Ghanaian society. She has since worked on numerous projects exploring colonial and post-colonial African history and politics. And do you want to say hi to our audience, Christiane? I think you're muted.
I'm sorry. Hello again. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
And then we have Tristan Ivory. Tristan is Assistant Professor of International and Comparative Labor at the School of Industrial and Labor Relations at Cornell. His research is concerned with sub-Saharan African geographic, social, and economic mobility, and mostly in Japan. Do you want to say hi to our audience, Tristan?
Yes, hello everyone. Really looking forward to the discussion today. So pleased to have you with us.
And our last speaker is Leigh Goffe. Professor Leigh Goffe is Assistant Professor of Africana Studies and Feminist, Gender and Sexuality Studies. She specializes in the narratives that emerge from histories of imperialism, migration, and globalization, especially in the Caribbean. Tao is running the Afro-Asia group that co-hosts today's event. Do you want to say hi to our audience, Tao?
Hi, everyone. Looking forward to the conversation today.
And I'm very sorry to inform everyone that our filmmaker, Markus, is not able to join us today due to family emergency. So we will, the panel would consist of Christiane, Tristan, Tao, and myself. And to start off, the three of us will each offer some very brief comments on the film, and then we will open the floor for or more dynamic conversation among the panelists and our audience. And you could start typing your comments or questions into the chat box anytime, and we will take them when it's a good time to do so. And I'll just go first with my comments. I want to say that this film really has a special place in my heart. I was born and raised in Guangzhou, and as a child, I knew there were parts of the city where we can meet many foreigners of different skin colors, speaking different languages, but there wasn't much information in the media about like who are they, what they do, and how their life is like. And as a Han Chinese and Cantonese speaking local, if I can still call myself a local, I think Guangzhou Dream Factory like offers me a different mapping of not only the populations that vitalize the city, but also it shows us the obscure physical and social spaces that actually form the key scenes of globalization in contemporary China. And many of us may remember how about a year ago, many residents of African descent in Guangzhou were evicted, forced into quarantine, and refused service at public spaces because they were in some way fabricated as a high-risk population that carried COVID, somewhat a mirror image to the anti-Asian sentiments we experience in the US. And although Guangzhou Dream Factory didn't show us that the anti-Black racism wasn't as blatant and crippling at that time, but it did capture many of the obstacles facing this community, such as the prejudice expressed by the local Chinese, the onerous visa renewal procedures, and the lack of social and institutional support, especially for those who have overstayed their visas and those operating in the informal economy, such as being sex workers, among other different obstacles. And I know this film has been screened a few times in Guangzhou, in universities, art museums, and foreign consulates, but I still can't, I still keep wondering what difference could it make if more local people could watch this film? Will they recognize in these individuals similar struggles they themselves have gone through or their parents have gone through? Moving from one place to another, seeking better economic opportunities, and somewhat disoriented by unfamiliar languages, cultures, and the lack of support. And while I don't want to just simply collapse the different migration experiences, I think Guangzhou Dream Factory did a really good job in making people's aspirations and frustrations concrete, and in revealing the worlds as people inhabit and experience them, so that we know we are not outside each other's worlds, but rather integral to it and have the power to build or destroy each other's world. And I'll just stop here and hand over to Tristan for his comments.
So thank you, Kun, for your comments, and also thank you for going ahead and setting this up. I wanted to make sure that we thank the labor of people that are kind of setting things up. It's very important to start off with that. So I'm very pleased to be here with you today to kind of share some thoughts and feelings. I've actually taught the film in 2 of my courses on African diasporic contemporary migration, and it's been very well received. I actually first was encountering Guangzhou during my first trip to mainland China for a Chinese in Africa, Africans in China conference, which is actually a very vibrant social studies group that Christiane, I think, has had some involvement with as well. And upon going there and seeing some of the community members during my first trip to Xiaobei, which is also featured in the film to some extent as well. So having that experience and then seeing the film rang true to a lot of what I had actually seen on the ground as well. It also parallels a lot of my own research with the African community in the Tokyo metropolitan area that I did from the early portion of the 2010s. And a lot of this research is important, and a film like Guangzhou Dream Factory is also important because it pushes back against this pervasive narrative of African helplessness or people from the diasporic community being a drain upon the system. When those of us who have had engagements with the African diasporic communities realize that many individuals are very self-efficacious and are just trying to go ahead and actually live a life of meaning and have engagements with other people across the world. I've found many people of African descent that are contemporary migrants to be very thoughtful, very enterprising, very committed global citizens in a way that unfortunately many people from the West often aren't. And we've seen in contemporary images that have actually been seen through the ongoing pandemic and a lot of inward turning that unfortunately the world is becoming a lot more inward looking. And that is someone whose research actually talks about a wider world, and a world that I've seen to be very open. That's very dismaying. So I think this film in particular is important for people to actually engage with, to realize the world is a lot smaller, and that the cross-cultural connections made between people are actually quite deep and substantive. And so I just wanted to praise Christiane and Erica, who can't be here today, unfortunately, and our thoughts go out with her, for your work in the film, which presents a very accessible and honest portrayal of issues faced by African migrants that rings true not only in Guangzhou, but in many parts of East Asia and beyond, that I can attest to. It's especially been useful for students in terms of actually thinking through these issues of contemporary African migration, and students very much appreciate the pace and representation and style of the film as well. And so I'll stop there and then pass it over to Tao, who will also give a couple of thoughts. So, and thank you. And I look forward to more questions with Christiane and the rest of folks as we go along.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think it's really important, as Tristan said, to center labor, because that is such an intimate portrait of labor and laboring that we get from this film. So thanks to Kun, to Tristan, to Christiane. We wished Erica could be here and send our thoughts to her, and to Amala as well for all of this Zoom magic that's taking place. And I'm also just grateful to Kun, especially for giving me the chance to revisit this film, because I saw it when it first came out, and now 4 years on, I think it will be a very interesting conversation for us all to have today. So I had written some remarks because I think I want to write a longer piece, and I'll just share a few of them with you right now. But watching the movie again pushed me towards this essay that I'm titling Saltwater Children, Roots and Routes of Afro-Chinese Temporality. So where I'm coming to this film from is the 19th century, so a very different moment, and to thinking about the twinned intimacy of cities like Hong Kong, Guangzhou, and its former name, right, of Canton. So Shanghai and Macau, all of these port cities are vibrant port cities of Chinese circulation, of migrants for centuries and centuries. And I kind of can't watch this film without putting it in that context. Because when I speak to people who are Caribbean Chinese, they often tell me, oh, my great-great-grandfather came from Canton, but they don't know that that's the same as Guangzhou. So there's interesting layers here to be kind of parsed out. And I think it's important to always disaggregate the difference between these different temporalities, different Chinas, different Guangzhous, and different groups of Black people, whether from the Caribbean or from Africa. But I think that the film really gives us a chance to consider triangulation, the difference between what it means to be a foreigner in China as a white person and as a Black person. So I hope today that we can talk about this category of race and what its salience is within China and what that means. So I think that from the vantage point that Christiane and Erica give us, we're able to not do that work of conflation that typically happens from the outside. We're able to disaggregate and hear the intimate stories of each of the different migrants. And personally, I started the Afro-Asia group in my position as a professor at Cornell as a way to answer a different question than the question I think a lot of us are so familiar with. And it always comes in the same kind of, expected way that people have really thought about, and they want to know about Chinese infrastructure and China in Africa, or China in the Caribbean, China in Latin America. It's always this question about, are they the new neocolonial power? And I want to suggest that we should be asking other questions. That's an important topic, but I think that Guangzhou Dream Factory gives us the chance to kind of take that, what motivates that question as not so much mistaken, but misplaced. And that we might focus instead on Black sociality and the individual lives of migrants from Africa and how they make their way in this vibrant port city with such a rich history. So looking at the various interracial couples and children who are Afro-Chinese, I think it's also significant to try to understand that these subjects have existed throughout time because of entangled temporalities as well as colonialities. And the Afro-Chinese child, as a kind of saltwater child of the port city, gives us an opportunity to ask the question of what race means in China, even if that question was never asked before. So I look forward to answering these questions and hearing, just what this means, the film means 4 years on, and how the reception has changed for Christiane as the filmmaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Tristan and Tao, for your very thoughtful comments. And before I hand it over for Christiane to maybe respond to some of the questions, I want to tell the audience we are opening a discussion. So you're welcome to submit your comments and questions and raise your hands to have a direct conversation with anyone on the panel. And we really want to make this an interactive event. So please feel free to do so. And Christiane, do you have anything to share with us in response to any of the questions or anything that you want us to know?
Yes, first of all, again, as you've heard, unfortunately, Erica Markus can't be here with us today. And she sends her best wishes and will watch the discussion afterwards. She was really looking forward to being a participant. I wanted to thank the three of you for your comments. They were so interesting and pertinent, and I'm so excited to see that the film touched the three of you in different ways. And I'm definitely looking forward to hearing questions and talking more. Because indeed, the situation in Guangzhou has changed since we made the film. And we ourselves have been back since making the film and have noted some of the changes. And yet, fundamentally, until the pandemic hit and kind of slowed trade to a certain extent, the underlying movement of people, that's kind of circular movement between Guangzhou, the African countries, and then some other cities that are on this trade route, hadn't really changed, even if things on the ground in Guangzhou have changed somewhat.
May I ask a following question? And because I'm curious in what are the changes you notice when you go back to Guangzhou after you make the film? Or I think Tristan mentioned this somewhere that how would the film be different if you make it maybe a few years later or now?
I think it would be hard to make the same film that we made. I feel like when we made the film already, we started research in the kind of heyday of the African community in Guangzhou. By the time we started filming the actual film a couple years later, things were already beginning to change. There had been some legal changes that were impacting the African community in terms of visas. Those changes took some time before they were felt on the ground, but they were starting to be felt. A number of people that we worked with left, not always by choice, often, in most cases, not by choice. So the situation had become more complicated in terms of the legal situation for the African community, but also things were changing in terms of trade, because what a number of people told us and then continued to tell us and still do to this day is that their kind of edge on the market, the reason that they had come to China in the first place to do business because they could buy and then go back to their countries and sell and make money. Well, the Chinese that they were dealing with were starting to make the same products, had better networks, were able to get the goods to Africa quicker, and were able to sell them cheaper, So even doing business the way they were doing business has changed. Which isn't to say there's not business, there still is, but the nature of it has changed somewhat. I mean, the people we talk to us about buying different products now than they did, 5 or so years ago. Also trying to sort of cover different markets, where they still had a competitive edge. I think this is just something you see all over the world, with the way globalization works. Things happen in one area and then prices come down and they move to another area and it goes on and on and on. So back to your question, if we were to do a film now, I'm not sure that we would film in Guangzhou the same way we did. We might film in several different locations to kind of look at the world of trade and how it's changed, because it is different than it was. We filmed between 2013 and 2016. So, that's been 4 years since our last film shoot for the project.
Thank you for your response, and I would be very curious in knowing how those transnational routes will actually map out in a more complex way than what is filmed in the original film. And I saw a hand from Tristan.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to jump in because what you said rang very true to me in terms of the community that I was approaching in Japan, is that by the time I was in Japan in the early 2010s, everyone was saying, oh, the hotspot and where people left, because the community used to be much bigger in Japan at the turn to the 21st century. And then a lot of people, the sort of inertia had moved to southern China, especially Guangzhou at that time. And I was wondering, you said you have contacts that have moved on. Those contexts that have moved on but not yet gone back to Africa, have they gone to places like Vietnam or other places in Southeast Asia or other places around the world? Because it is a lot of the West African communities that you're engaging with are trading communities, right? And so there's nothing really new here in terms of people. It's new to the West in terms of understanding that this kind of distance trading is a phenomenon, but it's actually fairly deeply embedded in a lot of those communities. So my suspicion is that people didn't just return home, but there are new circuits that people are working through. And so have you, as a filmmaker, have you kind of experienced that with your contacts, that people have moved on to other locations where they can earn a profit?
Yes, definitely. The people that we filmed, and then several people who worked with us sort of as background source informants, but they weren't in the film. A number of them have moved on to other Asian countries, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia. A number of them are, rather than settling down in one place, have just become more mobile. And that has to do with kind of the lack of the opportunities are no longer the same that they were in Guangzhou, so they feel that they can have a better return on investment by doing a trip where they're making several stops rather than just staying put in Guangzhou. So we found much more movement across South Asia, Southeast Asia, and then also we do have several people have gone back to their countries of origin and have set up businesses there, often working with Chinese nationals who they met in Guangzhou. So business ties that they established in Guangzhou now paying off back home. And then one person actually is still in Guangzhou, but has since opened a factory in the United States, which is sort of interesting. He started a tile factory in Guangzhou and then realized that his main market, it made more sense for him to open the factory in the US. So he's making tiles in the US for the US market. So I think that's something that's really important in the film that I hope comes across for people who watch it, because there's this kind of vision of the African migrant, the African immigrant, poor, desperate, which is just generally completely false. I mean, anyone who can move has the ability to move. But so many of the people in Guangzhou, although yes, you could always meet people who didn't really know what they're doing, but so many of the people are, seasoned business people. They know what they're doing. They have businesses. They are running their businesses. They are not, helpless migrants. They're entrepreneurs. And for us, that was something that was really important to show in the film, because that was, that was what we experienced, and we wanted viewers to be able to see that as well.
And I'll just step in to say, I feel that was one of the best parts of the film, is how micro it is, because I think it's a question of microfinance. It's a question of scale and of diasporic capital and the way that it circulates and always has circulated. So in terms of the work that I'm doing as a researcher, I'm writing a book called Black Capital, Chinese Debt. And it occurs to me kind of like a mirror image of this, because I'm looking at Chinese merchants and these other flows of microfinance. But yeah, I mean, it's just fascinating to think about how this money is flowing and how it may actually have nothing to do with China as a state or various African countries necessarily. So I feel like there was just a vibrant sense of that in how you were able to interview specific people. And I guess I just have to wonder, since I do look at the question of Afro-Chinese identity, I wonder how these children, how many generations are there in a place like Guangzhou who have both African and Chinese heritage, and how they fare. Because we saw the little girl who, I think she might have been West African, but she was in the kindergarten class, I think it was. And that was such a stunning portrait to see how quickly she learned Mandarin and the way that she was being acculturated and assimilated. So it would be really fascinating to do a part two, but I see the point that it would probably be other cities. And also selfishly, I would love to see this story in a place like Shenzhen, where my research takes place.
Yeah, we would love to go back, but I think another challenge that we would have today also is that would probably be harder to film than it was when we made the film, because the climate in China in terms of media has also changed significantly. We were surprised when we were last in China, which was late 2018. So it's been 2 years. But we were surprised already. We felt a different kind of vibe, just being out in the streets, with a camera. We weren't making a film, but we definitely we were in Guangzhou at this moment that was just a wonderful moment, because we were so free to basically, no one cared about what we were doing. And I think trying to go back today to follow up some stories, because there were wonderful stories with families and children. And yes, it would be great to follow up, but I think quite a challenge.
We have a couple of questions that were posted in the chat. One from Leanne Liu that's asking about the language, comparing kind of a country to an entire continent, and possibly speaking a little bit more about language, about ethnic and national origins of migration. And then one from Flair Donglaxi, who is asking about African Chinese families and wondering about mixed families and their children, and any sorts of information you have about mixed families and what's happened to them, and has the situation become better or worse, or that sort of thing. You're muted, Christiane.
To answer the question about Africans in China, Chinese in Africa, I know that's a very, it's very problematic framing things that way. I mean, in our film, you'll see, you know, the characters only come from a handful of countries. The majority of Africans in Guangzhou are Nigerian, which in part has to do with the trading history, the entrepreneurial history of the Igbo people. But it also has to do with demographics. I mean, Nigeria is the most populous country in Africa, so it's logical that there would be more Nigerians in China than other nationalities. But definitely the experience of different African countries in China is you know, it's very different country to country. And I can't speak as much to Chinese in Africa because my background in Africa is working in West and Central Africa. For example, I have not worked in East Africa. I've only been to South Africa once. But I understand the Chinese situation in African countries is also quite different. In both Nigeria and China, in both Nigeria and Ghana, for example, you can meet a Chinese community that has people who've been in the country for decades and same in South Africa, and people who only just arrived, you know, 2 months ago, and initially having to do with the colonial history, and then, you know, most recently because of economics and business. So it is kind of an oversimplification. It's a huge oversimplification to talk about Africans in China and Chinese in Africa, which is one reason that we called our film Guangzhou Dream Factory, because we were just focused on one place and a few people and their stories. And then the question about the families, I mean, that's a fascinating question. There's so much to find out. We didn't have a lot of time to research family stories. A number of the families that we met have one of the biggest problems that they face in Guangzhou is the problem of education, because the interracial couples, the Chinese African couples, tend to be primarily African men and Chinese women, and the Chinese women are not from Guangzhou on the whole. The vast majority are internal migrants. So they don't have residency in Guangzhou, and their children are not able to go to public school. So they have to go to private school, and the problem with private school is that once they get beyond elementary school, they are in international schools, you know, that are basically run for children of diplomats and are very expensive. So unfortunately, this leads to some children not being in school at all, some children being sent back to the village of the mother with the challenges that involves. And then we met a number of people who decided to move back to the African country, because they felt they would have better chance for education in Africa for their children, or going, you know, or leaving the country to go somewhere else. I think education is a huge hurdle. Excuse me, the education, and then of course the residency status, because one of the things we learned when we were working on the film is that just because you're born in China, even if your mother is Chinese, you're not necessarily going to be a Chinese citizen. It's not automatic. So that is another big challenge. So although this is a fascinating and changing story, I think for children of, you know, Chinese African marriages, they definitely face a lot of challenges in China for at least as things stand now.
Thank you. And I have a follow-up question for Christiane and maybe also for others. So we're talking about we don't want to lump together different people from the African continents, and I can see in the film that you always ask like, oh, which country are you coming from, and to basically to get down to the personal specificities. And also Tao also mentioned that there are also, for example, like people of African descent coming from the West to Guangzhou and to southern China, and how the experience might be different from the contemporary African migrants in China. And I think it's worthwhile to unpack all these differences. But my question is also, in what ways, like, is there any like emergence of like a Pan-African identity when they sort of do business and some of them settle in Guangzhou? And to what extent do African migrants in Guangzhou identify with the label Black? Because if we're talking about racism and racial issues here, I know many didn't first identify themselves as Black, but then like through this process of being identified as Black, and then they will slowly realize, yes, like anti-Blackness is something that is relevant to them. So I guess my question is, like, to what extent is there this like identification of like, oh, we are the African community in China or in Guangzhou, in your experience, Christiane, and maybe also Tristan and Tao in your different research contexts?
Oh, well, I'll just say quickly that when we first started our research in Guangzhou, we relied on several of the national associations for research assistants, so Nigerian, Ghanaian, Kenyan. But we also attended several meetings that were umbrella meetings of Africans in China of all nationalities. There were definitely issues at that time, which was 2010, 11, 12. You know, there were issues that were of concern to all Africans. And so there was a reason for people to meet beyond their national identities. Since that time, I mean, we've met and worked with a number of Black British people in Guangzhou, several African-American people, but I personally haven't spent enough time in Guangzhou in kind of social circles to get a sense of, you know, a real diaspora community that, you know, includes people from North America or Europe. I imagine that Tristan or Tao can speak more to that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think that the film really stirred up memories for me because I was in Shanghai on a fellowship in 2017, I think it was. So around the time that your movie debuted. And definitely my experience was one of anti-Blackness in a way that I have never experienced in my entire life. So it was interesting, especially in a different port city, Shanghai, to feel this anti-Blackness, but also surveillance. I think similar to what you're gesturing to in terms of how it would not be as easy to film today. And I think that 2017 was a particular moment where I was hearing more and more about surveillance and also about Western researchers in Chinese archives and just knowing that they were being surveilled. So I was very hyper aware of what that would mean because I was at NYU Shanghai. So it really just conjured up for me, you know, what if this is my experience in 2017, where, for instance, I couldn't hail a cab with a friend who's Nigerian American. We stood in the street for an hour trying to get different cab drivers to pick us up to go home at night. It was almost impossible. The person who did pick us up, cab driver, was just excited because he was like, oh, Obama, to give us a ride finally so we could get back home safely. And I guess these different things mount and made me think about my grandfather's experience, because he would be like one of those children that you described, Christiane, who would be living in, say, the home village of their Chinese parent. So he migrated from Jamaica to China in the 1930s, was born to a Black mother, Chinese father. And yeah, I've wondered what his experience would have been like. But when I was there in 2017 and I experienced that, I knew that it had to be one of this kind of racialization that we're talking about, where it couldn't have been that race wasn't a category. And if I went through this, then he must have experienced this kind of alienation, being the only Black person in a Chinese village. But from family who I've interviewed about that time in China, they seem to suggest that there was no racism because there were so many Afro-Chinese people, which is an interesting idea to think about 1930s China. But yeah, certainly your film had me thinking about those subjectivities, especially with all of the children and babies that you center with the camera.
Yeah, so the experiences of a kind of African diaspora community in Japan, I think, are slightly different than they would be in China in some sense. I think East Asia has some similarities, but some pretty important differences. And I think part of it is just simply that the communities had been there for so substantially longer in like the Tokyo metropolitan region since the beginning of the 80s. And so, of course, it sort of drills down to some extent in terms of national origin group. Like the Nigerians were pretty much had a spoiled identity, and a number of African peoples would very clearly try and distinguish themselves as not being Nigerian to avoid that sort of negative characterization. And I think that actually is something that happens across a lot of parts of the United States, unfortunately, or not the United States, a lot of the world, unfortunately, due to very negative depictions of Nigeria in the media. But I think what was also very important in a sense that I think the movie alludes to in some degrees is a matter of class as well. So class and national origin coming together to affect very different kind of orientations and very different experiences. So when I was in Japan, individuals that were coming over as high-skilled professionals or students, right, would have a very pleasant experience in terms of kind of adapting to this like larger Black or African diasporic community, or even an international community, or even a community of linguistic fellows. So like a Francophone community or an Anglophone community. But individuals that were coming over primarily as laborers, right, were pretty much constrained to their ethnic community and sort of co-ethnics or co-nationals. And those individuals were much more likely to feel the sort of long arm of the state, surveillance, detention. And I think Japanese officials in some sense were able to discriminate in terms of the, you know, kind of actual denotation of that word between people who were like moneyed and people who were less moneyed. And so it's something that I think bears paying attention to because the sort of individual experiences of people and able to tap into this larger community or able to avoid experiences of negative racialization will largely depend on the sort of economic resources that people have at their disposal. And so in a sense, coming from the West or coming from certain sorts of backgrounds provides you a firewall against certain very negative discriminations. There have been a number of comments in the chat. So it's starting with Dinshin, I think. And so we probably want to go ahead and get to those. So I'll stop my comments right now.
Yeah, I'm looking at some questions.
Yes, there are a few questions that sent directly to me. So if I can recap very quickly. So someone asked that so visa issue is one of the major threats in the narrative, and they're wondering if you have thought about filming that from the Chinese migration policy perspective and how it would be like. And the second question from this person is it's about sex workers in the film, and they think it's a very interesting angle. And do you think there is more story to tell, but you cannot tell them because is there any ethical or logistical problems? Do you want to respond to that very quickly, Christian?
Yes, in terms of the sex workers, I'll answer that question first. When we first were in Guangzhou, our very first research trip to Guangzhou, which was in, like I said, we started working on the project 10 years ago. At that time, there were sex workers who were visible on the streets. not everywhere, in very specific locations. But already, even by the time we started our actual filming, because we filmed each time we were in China, but initially we were filming mainly for research purposes and also for fundraising purposes. But when we started our official filming, already by then there were very few visible sex workers. I think the numbers of sex workers had declined. I think too that the situation, as I mentioned, with the various kind of crackdowns that were happening, that was one of the things that got, the streets. There was this campaign to like clean the streets, get rid of ambulant merchants, that mainly Chinese, get rid of, the visible sex workers on the streets. So it would have been quite difficult for us to film. I think it would have been interesting, but a very different story. And, we didn't make any attempts to actually pursue that angle. But I did want to mention one thing in regards to previous comments. One of the things we had a number of African people from different countries tell us in Guangzhou was that they love to come to Guangzhou as opposed to Shanghai or some other cities, because they felt that in Guangzhou there was a big enough African population that was present, that people were more used to Africans and they didn't feel the same kind of being singled out or being followed or being hassled or, being even, sort of that feeling that you can have of being, an object of curiosity. People want to come and touch your hair or whatever. So Guangzhou was seen, people told us, oh, I study in Wuhan or I study wherever, but I come to Guangzhou on my school breaks because I feel I feel relaxed here. Also, I can do a little business while I'm here. We met students from all over China who, would come to Guangzhou to do business. So I do think that Guangzhou also had for African people living all over China, Guangzhou had a kind of special feeling, at least while things were, good. Whether that's the case anymore today, I'm not sure.
That is interesting. Could I follow up with a question? Mm-hmm. So yeah, I feel, I talked a bit about triangulation, racial triangulation, and how it's usually between white, Black, and Asian in this kind of geometry. So I wondered if you could speak, I guess, directly to how it felt for you to be there as a white person then in Guangzhou and as an American, in the sense of, did people look at you as a curiosity or not? And is that just how it is in Guangzhou? Because thinking about my time in Shanghai, it was clear that definitely white people and Black people are oddities. Like they are, it's a homogenous society in a sense, or it seems to be, but it was definitely a different treatment that white Americans, when I was at NYU, how they were treated than African Americans in a place like Shanghai. So I'm wondering if in Guangzhou, especially for both of you being there with cameras, if you felt any of that sense.
Yes, we definitely felt that we were also oddities, which, for me was quite interesting. I feel that way. I felt that way working in certain places in Africa, but that's because my work has sometimes taken me to places where there's literally no foreigners. So I'm the only foreigner in some instances. I'm the first white person someone has ever seen. But I was surprised to be in Guangzhou and have that, people wanting to take pictures, And I noticed we went out sometimes with, especially with Favor, the Nigerian woman with her daughter Cherish. We spent a lot of time socializing with them, sometimes for the film, sometimes just, being just socializing. And it would be interesting when we would go out together, the way that she would get looked at versus the way I would get looked at. And there's definitely a kind of regard at foreigners, but that is not at all the same, if you're white or if you're Black. I do feel personally for us making the film, I think we had a bit of an entree with both African people and Chinese people because we were not Chinese and we were not African. We had some Chinese people who I think talked to us in ways that maybe they wouldn't have talked to us if we had been African. And then the African people that we talked to, I think there was a little bit of that. I feel like, especially with some of the people who were in the film, they connected to me because maybe I'd been where they were from in their home countries, or I knew about business, because the origin of this film sort of came from both of us, but I'd been working in Africa for a long time and I'd seen, Chinese goods, Chinese people, but then I also saw lots of African people going to China, and I wondered, well, what is this all about? So anyway, the fact that I had that kind of familiarity with sort of what was happening, back home, that was a way to kind of connect with people. But I think in sometimes there's an advantage to being a total outsider when you're working on a project. Other times it's you need to be an insider. You can't get information. It works both ways. But I think in this particular project, we were able to, by being outsiders, we were able to connect on in both communities. And I should say, I don't speak Chinese, but Erica speaks fluent Mandarin. And she spent most of her career working in China or in Hong Kong. So that's kind of how we came together. I was the person who had the background in Africa. She's the person who had the background in China. And we both, we used our different experiences to, get the people that we needed together to make the film.
Yeah. So there are a couple of questions, I think, on in the chat. One was asking about the hukou in terms of migration as well, like language, lingua franca. I think any of those would probably be good to probably.
Yeah, I can summarize. There's a set of questions related to internal migrants. So there are several people asking about it, and some of the questions are. Do internal migrants from other parts of China who move to Guangzhou face similar obstacles when they try to start business? And is there any sort of like migrant solidarity that is happening that you have observed between internal migrants and also like foreign migrants? And then there are this, let's say I know African couples and many of the women are internal migrants from elsewhere and do their status as non-locals in different sense, like add to the discrimination of and of their children's status and education. Is there like a dual process of discrimination, or is it mostly because one of the parents is foreigner, or is it mostly because none of the parents are a local, have urban hukou in a sense? And so there's one set of questions, and I think there's another set of questions that is worth tackling if we're really short of time. Are several people asked about the Africa side of the story. So have this film been screened in Africa, and what was the response? And also in this film, you show that there are many who have sacrificed or they have lent money from their families to be able to be in China. So, but then they cannot go back because they haven't like really be successful, or they don't have the means to go back. So what's the story like on the side of their family? On the African continents, who have some members in China, and so what would be their perspective on this? So there's a set of questions. Maybe Christiane can decide which ones you want to take.
Just really quickly on the hukou question. I mean, that is the problem that I spoke about earlier. When neither one of the parents is a resident of Guangzhou, the mother is an internal migrant from somewhere else in China. So her children cannot automatically go to public school in China. And as the father is a Nigerian or Ugandan or whatever, there's no hukou, there's no ability to go to public school. So education is a huge challenge. And then someone asked about why a child couldn't get Chinese citizenship if one of their parents is Chinese. I don't know the details. I'm not an expert on that, but I do know that it's not automatic and it's not easy. And I believe that the number of citizens can be counted on one hand or two. It's that much of a challenge. But also a number of the marriages that are practiced at church. One of the ways that people meet in Chinese African couples, it's often church related, and church weddings are not legally recognized. So a number of people are married, but they don't have a legal Chinese marriage. So I would say that on the whole, the legal situation is just very complicated and is not something that is easy to deal with. I mean, I'm sure, people understand, if you're in the US and you don't have a green card, even if you've been, in the US for years, or, the situation with dreamers, it's hard for immigrants everywhere. And depending on when you came and what the status was, at that time, and it's changed since, it's very hard in China, but I think people who are immigrants anywhere understand the challenges of being an immigrant and trying to get papers and trying to have your children get papers if you're living in a country that doesn't have droit de sol. I don't know, you're born and you're an automatic citizen like the United States. So that's one thing. And then people who come and they can't make money and then they get stuck. That too is unfortunately a story of immigrants also all over the world. And I think it's particularly challenging for African immigrants because often, their families have put up like all the family money to send someone to another country. And there's an incredible shame. You don't want your parents to know, you don't want your family to know that you haven't made it big. And so you don't communicate or you lie. And, this kind of perpetuates further problems. But I think, people do what they always do. They hustle, they figure out ways to make money. And then usually my experience with the people that we met and worked with was basically they just stayed long enough to get out if they really, weren't able to make any money with business. And looking very quickly, someone asked about migrant solidarity. That was something we didn't encounter. Although we did meet, different people from different countries who spoke with, inter-migrant communication about different visa issues and challenges, but we didn't experience any sort of solidarity. But two interesting things. One, a number of the Chinese women, internal migrants who came to Guangzhou, looking for work, for jobs, for a better life, meeting these African men and marrying them, they then, were able to go to Africa and start businesses. So for many people, these African migrants, which in some circumstances, were looked down on by the government and certain Chinese, in some circles, these same people were seen as an opportunity. because these are smart businessmen, they know what they're doing. We can work together, we can open a shop, we can go back to Ghana or Nigeria or whatever and open a business there. So there's definitely, a kind of solidarity on that level, a familiar, just the family unit, but this idea that two together were stronger than one, because opening a business in China, you have to have a Chinese partner. So these African business people must have a Chinese partner, and often it's a spouse. But also to go back and open a business in Africa dealing with Chinese goods, it's easier if you have a Chinese partner too. So, there's advantages. I think someone asked a question about, is this a positive, a negative, uplifting, or desperate story? I think it's everything. It's all of the above. But I feel like more than anything, I think these stories, the more people hear these stories, the more they can feel, hopefully, these are the stories of in the whole world. Tristan said this earlier, the world is so connected, and it's the way it is, and it's actually beautiful and wonderful. And the fact that, now we're closing borders and shutting doors, and things have gotten so much worse with the pandemic, it's a real shame, because if nothing else, when you're in Guangzhou and you're meeting people from different parts of the world and seeing these relationships growing, it gives you hope that maybe there can be the world can be a better, it sounds sort of corny, but that the world can be a better place and people can actually find ways to live together in peace rather than, war.
Yeah, I think we are running a bit over time. I actually I'm curious about, how is this film received in African countries where you have the chance to show it?
The place where we've had the least opportunity to show the film is actually on the African continent. The film has screened in Ghana. I've traveled, I've shown the film in South Africa, I've shown the film in Ghana, the film screened in Tanzania, but getting the film seen in Africa is a huge challenge, because in a number of places, the bandwidth of the internet is not good enough to stream the film. A number of places, it's hard to mail a DVD. You have to ship it FedEx or something. So it becomes very costly. So what's crazy is that it's the place that we've had the hardest time getting the film seen. And just before the whole COVID pandemic started, we were working on fundraising with different partners to be able to get the film seen, at least in the countries where our main characters are from. And actually, some of the characters in the film are now back in their home countries. So we were working to have them be present at the screenings. And anyway, hopefully one day when we're able to get outside again, we'll be able to screen the film in Africa. But so far we've screened it much more in China than we have in Africa.
And I think some people asked about how we can educate ourselves more about the hookah policy and also the Africans in China. And I sort of compile a list of sources. It seems I'm not able to send it via chat. Okay, maybe I'll do it via the Zoom registration and see if we can send you guys some more bibliography regarding this issue. And I think we are really toward the end of our event. Do we have some last words from the panelists for our audience?
Thank you for organizing this conversation. I think more in-depth, specific conversations need to be had like this. So thanks for the invitation, and thanks to the audience for being here and asking such thought-provoking questions.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity to go ahead and engage in dialogue. And thank you again, Christiane, for sort of releasing this into the world, and then Kun and Namala for all the technical and logistical support. It's been great. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. And Christiane?
No, I just want to say thank you too. I really, really enjoyed this opportunity to chat with all of you, and it was wonderful to hear from the three of you and to hear about your experiences. And I am looking forward to reading your work. And also, I just want to say to the people in the chat who, we unfortunately didn't get to all the questions, just thank you so much for your thoughtful questions and your response to the film. And I'm really glad you all had a chance to see it. And I hope, I hope it was good for you.
Yeah, and I think the Vimeo link is still accessible, right? It's still available for a short while.
Yes.
And for Cornell members, the film can be accessed on Canopy, and at least to the end of this year. We sort of like bought the subscription for this year. And if you have enjoyed it and learned from the film, like we really encourage you to share it with your friends and colleagues. And yeah, and thank you once again for joining us today. And please join me in thanking our panelists, filmmakers Christiane, Tristan, and Tao. And thank you all for coming.